I got quite a good question coming in from email the other day, so I'd like to read it and then I'm going to address it point by point. Okay. Dear Samuel, how do you see contemporary classical music, for want of a more accurate term, as being culturally relevant? My background is firmly rooted in the working class of the north of England. I became interested in contemporary classical music and even chose a university which focuses heavily on new music to study for my degree, but it does somewhat feel like a parallel universe with regards to having or failing to have a clearly observable, widespread cultural and social impact. Despite new music being of great personal interest to me, it also feels largely irrelevant to my social environment, and I don't find reconciling my feelings on the matter to be a simple task. I'm specifically interested in how you see contemporary classical music as affecting culture outside of the demographic who directly consume or create it. This will obviously vary from place to place, and its impact won't always be direct, but I'm interested in your personal experience of it. Okay, so that's actually a fairly complex question, and it's several questions in one, so I'm going to pull this apart. So the first part of your question is, how do I see contemporary classical music as being culturally relevant? So in order to provide some kind of an answer to that question, I would need to know, first of all, what it is that you mean by relevant. So what is the yardstick by which you determine whether something is relevant or not? And second of all, relevant to whom? Because if you require things to be universally relevant to all of humanity in order to qualify as being relevant, then a great deal of things would immediately go out the window. So let's look at that for a second. So I suppose relevant could mean, and I'm guessing here because I don't know what your personal definition is, but for me it would mean that it's a subject of discussion. First of all, people are interested in hearing about it and interested in talking about it. It would mean that people are interested in engaging with it to some degree. So if it's a cultural product, if it's a painting, they're interested in looking at it. If it's a piece of music, they're interested in hearing it, and so on. But as far as I can determine, that is the case with the sorts of music that I've been describing on the channel and the sorts of work that I try to do myself. So I'm averaging about 40,000 views a month now, and I'm only looking at what by any standard would be quite avant-garde, relatively unfamiliar repertoire, let's put it that way. And there's certainly been a massive response, far beyond anything I could possibly have imagined. So I see that as a very positive sign. I think part of the problem actually might be that a lot of composers and a lot of people who are active in the musical cultural industry are not terribly good at marketing. So I think that's probably a big part of it. And secondly, it's not something that everybody wants to listen to, and that's just the way it is. And I don't find that to be a particular issue necessarily. I mean, there's lots of things that I'm not interested in. I'm not interested in reading crime novels, for example. But that doesn't mean that crime novels are completely irrelevant, and it would be better if they didn't exist. So it just simply means that I personally am not particularly interested in them. So, okay, the next part of your question, you say that contemporary classical music seems somewhat like a parallel universe with regards to having or failing to have a clearly observable widespread cultural and social impact. So the first part of that question is, well, why do you require something to have a widespread cultural or social impact in order for it to be important? So, there are lots of things that don't meet that criteria, but that are nevertheless important, maybe only on an individual basis or on the level of a small community or something like that. They're not going to be on the evening news. They're not going to be written up in the newspaper necessarily, but it doesn't mean that they don't have any utility whatsoever in society. So societies are very large and very complex, and they can accommodate a lot of different divergent viewpoints and practices and aesthetic interests, and there's room for a lot of different things. And that doesn't mean that those things are necessarily irrelevant if they don't attract the attention of the majority. Far from it. Secondly, it's extraordinarily difficult to quantify the impact of a work of art. I mean, what do you mean by impact exactly? So I can give you a couple of very obvious examples. One being Edgar Varèse, the sort of experimental French/American composer who toiled in obscurity his entire life. He had a very difficult life. His work was not popular at all. He completed only a very small number of scores during his lifetime. And after his death, Frank Zappa, a young Californian rock musician, discovers Edgar Varèse, and it changes the course of his life. And Frank Zappa goes on to have a massive cultural impact. You could certainly say that Varèse had a certain role to play in that. So another example is Revolution 9 by the Beatles, which was directly inspired by them having listened to Stockhausen. Works like Gesang der Jünglinge. That particular track has been listened to by tens of millions of people. So it's very, very difficult to quantify. I suppose if you were to look at individual works of music written in an experimental tradition since the Second World War, the vast majority of them are not familiar to the public. That's absolutely true, but it doesn't mean that they don't filter down in some manner or another and have an impact. So, a lot of composers aren't necessarily household names, but it doesn't mean that they don't affect our perceptions of reality or they don't affect the sorts of music that we hear nevertheless. I mean, how many people know the name of the inventor of the microchip, for example? A lot of these people are also toiling in relative obscurity unless you happen to be in the tech industry and you know this sort of stuff very well. So that would be my answer to that. Okay, so the last part of your question. You say, I'm specifically interested in how you see contemporary classical music as affecting culture outside of the demographic who directly consume or create it. Okay, so there again, it's very easy to create a unit of measure by which everything that a person does appears to be absurd or irrelevant or meaningless. And that doesn't actually say anything about the activity that you're pursuing. It simply says that you've managed to come up with a unit of measure that is ridiculous. So, for example, yes, it's absolutely true that people who don't engage in the creation of contemporary classical music or listen to it or engage in it in any manner are not affected by it. But that's like saying people who don't go outside in the rain don't get wet. It's just kind of a statement of the obvious. It's going to be relevant to people who take the time to engage with it and who are interested in it and who enjoy it. And it's going to be irrelevant to people who don't do those things. But that doesn't really say anything about the art itself. It just says something about what people are interested in and what they're not interested in. And that's about it. I don't think that a composer can really worry too much about these questions. I think you need to be rigorously authentic. You need to pursue what is important and meaningful to you. And independent of career terms, incidentally, I don't know too many composers who have become successful through doing what they expect people are going to want them to do. I don't find that ever really works out. I find that composers who have a very strong personal point of view and pursue it with relentless devotion eventually achieve success of some sort. There aren't a lot of people like that, by the way, because it's very difficult to keep on pursuing a creative vision in the face of all of the innumerable obstacles that you're inevitably going to face when you decide to pursue that sort of a path. People aren't going to like it, they're not going to want to play it, you're not going to have enough money, you're not going to be able to get festivals interested in you, etc., etc., etc. I mean, there's endless obstacles. So it's not surprising that a lot of people give up or that they don't make it or that they try to tailor their music towards a specific taste in order to achieve success in the short term. The people who can get past all of those barriers, pursue their vision, despite the extraordinary difficulty that they're going to face, are definitely in the minority. But they exist, and those are the ones that, in my view, make a real difference. So that's my answer. Thank you for the very interesting question. And I'll see you very soon with a new analysis video. Thank you.